I'm ready. I need a link. That's what I keep hearing. How are you going to send it? How are you going to send it? All right, we're live again, I think. Anybody give me an indication of whether you can hear me? It appears we were hacked. So I don't think we violated any community rules, and yet that's the story we were told. So there you have it. And no, we don't see any of the chat from the previous live stream. So all that has gone away. If you had questions, please ask again in the chat here, because we don't have access to the chat that disappeared. I've been hacked repeatedly, Jimmy John, to answer your question. Many, many, many times, dating back at least several years. The most interesting case, I was at a conference, a hacker conference of all things, outside of Amsterdam. It was completely off grid, and yet it had more bandwidth than Africa. I was hacked right before the conference started. 4 people wrote to me and said, "Hey, I can fix that for you if you'd like." And I turned them all down, and I said, the host is going to fix it. At the time, I think it was HostGator was hosting my site, and I'd written to them, and they didn't do anything. And I finally figured out they're not going to do anything. So the 5th person who contacted me, I told him yes, then I thought about it, and I asked him to fix it. And I gave him my login credentials, and he wrote back and said, "It's fixed. And by the way, these are your login credentials, not the information you sent me." So he was such an amazingly good hacker that he fixed the website within a couple of hours, and he was able to hack into it without having the login credentials that I had apparently misplaced. Whew. Regarding the loss of plankton, 50% of oxygen, will people be able to breathe properly, or will it make us living zombies like those in DC? Good question. Well said. And already in many cities around the world, the ability to access oxygen is making people's cognition decline. So less oxygen is the last thing we need in Washington, D.C. and beyond. The the rate of change here is critically important. Increased carbon dioxide, lower oxygen in the atmosphere is bad news, and it will have negative impacts on every organism that depends upon oxygen for survival. And that means vertebrates and mammals and reptiles and any number of other organisms. And there is absolutely no guarantee bacteria will carry on. The paper by Strona and Bradshaw says 5 to 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise is enough to kill all life on Earth. We're headed there very quickly, well beyond 5 to 6 C. So I strongly suspect we're going to leave this rock as a rock with no life. I can't imagine any way to avoid that at this point. Never mind the catastrophic meltdown of the world's nuclear power plants, stripping away the atmosphere. Without an atmosphere, not even bacteria survive. Okay, sorry for the disruption, folks. Thanks for joining us again. And I'm not sure that everybody knows because we have a new link. So I don't know if everybody was able to jump. Perhaps somebody can answer me this, one or two people from the chat. How did you get back in? How did you know there was a new link? Was it a new link? Am I confused about this and most other things? Please send me a little chat message and let us know. Do I suspect that the government pays people to inhibit my message? Yes. And this kind of activity has been reported for many years now, at least 8 years that I have read reports of government entities and also people who cannot be identified, which screams government at me, paying people to be trolls, basically, or to be hackers. There's some very talented people out there. Welcome, Bell Creek, to the Nature Bats Last channel on YouTube as a member. Thank you very much for joining. Okay. So apparently everybody was able to just refresh the YouTube page. I tried that. It didn't work for me. But I'm a Luddite, so that might explain part of my problem. Oh, and somebody got a notification. All right. Well, that's good. Jimmy John asks if there are other sources of aerosols that are not produced as a result of industrial activity. Yes. I mentioned this on one of these live streams maybe a month or so ago. The Himalayas are a source of aerosols of considerable significance. And the first study on the topic in the peer-reviewed literature just basically discovered that the Himalayas were producing an enormous amount of aerosols. And I haven't seen any further information about that, and I did not see any comparison of the Himalayas and those aerosols relative to fossil fuels. It seemed to be a regional phenomenon, and I pointed out at the time that there's a lot we don't know. So I haven't seen subsequent information. There may be other sources as well that I'm just not aware of, or that we generally are not aware of at this point. That was new to me, this study in the Himalayas, and apparently it was a surprise to the researchers as well. Jim and John, I've been looking into that question for at least a year now. How many degrees C can we expect immediately following an ice-free summer Arctic? Now, because of the change in albedo, there will be a significant, very rapid rise in global average temperature. And I've dug around in all the peer-reviewed literature I can track down for that topic, and it seems that that would be certainly enough to destroy industrial civilization because we're so close to the brink already, and the very rapid rate of change following an ice-free Arctic as a result of loss of albedo would trigger a very rapid environmental change induced by a very rapid global average temperature rise. And I haven't been able to find out how much by adding together all the relevant pieces of that particular puzzle. There's the latent heat. That is, the heat that goes into the ocean is being absorbed by the ice to allow the ice to melt. That takes an enormous amount of energy to melt ice. Once the ice is gone, that same amount of energy is going into heating the water. That's huge, and I haven't seen anybody address how huge that would be, because I think it's difficult to characterize the volume of the Arctic Ocean, at least in the upper layers. So there's at least the albedo, the loss of aerosol masking resulting from destruction or near destruction of industrial activities. There's the latent heat issue. There may be others, I don't know. But it seems to me it would be the rapidity of the change would be enormous. And whether that would produce 5 or 6 degrees temperature rise sufficient to destroy all life on Earth, I don't know. But it brings with it the uncontrolled meltdown of the world's nuclear power plants. So one way or another, I think we're headed for a lifeless planet. Not by next Tuesday, and not even by next year, but I think it's not far away relative to the kinds of temporal spans paleoecologists use, for example. Do I agree with the theory that the jet stream will shift towards Greenland following a blue ocean event? Beckwith predicts crop growing region will shift towards Canada. Can the same crops be grown there? No, of course not. Again, complete lack of understanding of biology and ecology by Mr. Beckwith. And like so many people, he thinks that we can just pick up all the grain that is growing in the enormously productive mollisol soils that are found in the American Great Plains and just pick it up and move it to the spodosols, the soils that in the North Country will not support productive grain crops. So that's absolute nonsense. It's not as if the world is homogeneous and we can just pick up plants from one place and grow them in another. That's not going to happen. That has never happened. Given the rate of change, there is no way that we can take crop plants and move them from one place to another. That's ridiculous and not surprising considering the source. But that said, I do not know. We're entering a whole new world, the kind of heating that humans obviously have never experienced before. So it's very difficult to predict what will happen in the future, and we can't even use the paleo record as any sort of basis to tell us where we're headed, because again, the rate of change this time is so much faster than it's ever been before. So the jet stream might shift towards Greenland, or maybe it won't. I don't think we have enough information to make that kind of prediction. I think we have enough information to predict that the loss of vertebrate mammals and the loss of all life on Earth is going to happen, but not by Tuesday and not even by the end of this year. Jimmy John points out that Shakova expects methane fluxes to increase 5% annually for the next 50 years, and we don't have 50 years. How would this kind of conservative projection affect yours and Karana's 2026 prediction? You have to bear in mind that prediction of Karana's and my adoption of that prediction is based only to a very small extent on methane getting into the atmosphere. So I pointed out in my latest peer-reviewed journal article that there are 7 different ways that we could lose habitat for humans in the near future. Methane in the atmosphere is one of those ways. So there are many ways we can drive ourselves to extinction. As a consequence, this conservative projection affects my prediction not at all. Have I seen any new research on methane? Actually, in my presentations going back probably a year and a half, when I did my latest tour, March and April, in Alaska and then California and then Oregon, if you look on the NatureBat's last blog, GuyMcPherson.com, and poke around in those presentations from that tour, I suspect you'll see me mention quite a few times that there are peer-reviewed articles not conducted by Shakova's research group pointing to methane release into the atmosphere being much worse than people like Michael Mann, for example, and others are predicting. That's a good point, Pauline. Anyone who's ever gardened, even on a small scale, quickly figures out that micro ecosystems are everywhere and that there are microclimates that make a tremendous importance. One part of a garden will grow a nice head of lettuce, another part of the garden won't. So these microclimates are critically important, and the notion that we can pick up a bunch of plants and move them to a completely different soil is kind of silly. What are some important extinction cascades to look out for? What kind of co-extinctions do you think precede human extinction? Exactly the kinds of things we're seeing today. Loss of habitat for vertebrates, loss of habitat for mammals, well underway, and predicted and projected to be much higher. I would encourage everybody to read the latest paper, senior authored by Gerardo Ceballos. It came out middle of last year, as I recall, middle of 2020. And I'm trying to find the citation without immediate success. And I'm not having luck. But it's easy to find, to track down. It's an open access journal that it was published in. Senior author is Gerardo Ceballos, and other authors include Paul Ehrlich and Peter Raven. And the paper points out that vertebrates are on the brink as a result of ongoing changes in the environment. So I think we are As pointed out in the latest paper by Gerardo Ceballos and Paul Ehrlich and Peter Raven, I think that we are already on the brink, that we are observing exactly what we would expect in light of co-extinctions. A bunch of species that look in many ways like us, resemble in many ways us, are already going extinct, are already losing habitat around the world. As are we, by the way, as pointed out in the 2020 paper by Colin Raymond and colleagues in Science Advances, pointing to exceeding lethal wet bulb temperatures in the tropics and subtropics. And that's for now, but what about next year? Nothing is getting any better. What are some ways we can protect wildlife/ecosystem from the coming bottleneck for as long as possible? These ways have been well studied and well implemented by wildlife biologists and conservation biologists essentially forever. Anything we can do to establish reserves, as Kevin Hester is trying to do with respect to a marine reserve off the New Zealand coast, that's a great idea. Anything we can do to minimize human activity in relatively large areas. One definition of wilderness that I particularly like is that it is of sufficient size and variation that it allows for natural selection. So that's taking the long view. That is taking the very long view when it comes to habitat. Habitat necessarily includes reproduction by the organism in question. So those are the kinds of things that we can do, is protect very large areas for as long as possible. James wondering what the loss of flight traffic due to the pandemic had on the aerosol masking effect. The aerosol masking effect is different from the effect of contrails. The effect of contrails is much shorter lived. We're talking about the magnitude of a day or two. And so once the planes stop flying, the impact is virtually immediate, and the recovery is likewise almost immediate. So I haven't seen any peer-reviewed articles on that particular topic. So that would be interesting to look into. How has the refreeze been in the Arctic this year? Is it behind where it should be, especially with March closing in? I haven't actually looked for the last few weeks, so I don't know, but there are several sources of Arctic ice volume and extent that are readily publicly available. Bell Creek, thanks for your first question as a member. Would you say the recent weather events in Spain are an indicator of the jet stream seriously going wrong? Yes, absolutely. The jet stream and also the Gulf Stream, the thermohaline conveyor belt, as it's called, that transports water from the warm tropical Atlantic up to and along the coast, along the western coast of Europe, thereby bringing warm, wet air to that region, has been critically important in maintaining the Mediterranean climate. All bets are off now. It's crazy time. Delana says my crepe myrtle that was planted above a broken water pipe grew much bigger than the other ones. Maybe water was the limiting factor there. Kind of sounds like it to me. So, James, I would recommend not telling your mom about this anymore. She's going to become angry and shout, especially if she's shouting at you. I would run away. Some people do not want to have the conversation. They are not emotionally and cognitively capable of having the conversation. So, why bother? Get on with your life. Jimmy John, according to mirrors, one mirror can remove 1 ton of CO2. If we produce 100 million tons of CO2 per day without mentioning feedbacks, how is this a viable solution? It's a viable solution only if it scales up, obviously. And it can be scaled up relatively quickly. It relies upon materials that are readily and inexpensively available. So if the mirror reflection project had the kind of support that your typical billionaire could provide without even noticing, it could be scaled up within a year to produce profound impacts on retention of habitat for humans. Casper asked, do you know to some extent what effect the year 2020 has had on the aerosol masking effect? And I reported on this a few times. The timing was perfect. The reduction in industrial activity apparently was insufficient to cause a relatively long-term loss of aerosol masking at the time of year that would have been catastrophic. So again, the first and third waves of the pandemic occurred at the perfect time in terms of retention of habitat for humans in the winter, late fall, early spring. So if we have those kinds of events happening during the spring and summer, then we're in a world of hurt, because all of all of the impacts on the climate, especially the short-term impacts, have to be mediated through plant life before we will feel them, before we will notice them. And when that happens, we are in real trouble. James Gilchrist says, my coworker said that Guy McPherson is just like a televangelist who always says the world is coming to an end. Always? You know, the televangelists actually make money at their gig. Me, not so much. In fact, the transmission of my message by me has pretty much destroyed my life. So I think that's not an appropriate analog. HM, welcome to the Nature Bats Last YouTube channel as a member, specifically as a climate defender. Thank you very much for joining the channel as a member. No representation. I think you can conclude that a 20% loss of aerosols then is not sufficient to get global damming impact loss felt. I disagree completely. I think 20% will do the trick. It's all about the timing. This is something that I've explained a few thousand times to people who are not conservation biologists. This is a primary reason I think climate scientists have been missing the boat for at least 100 years. It's all about the timing. It's all about the rate of change. It's all about the season. And nobody is looking at any of those factors. There is only a 6 or 7% decline in carbon dioxide output. If that corresponds to industrial activity, then it's only a 6 or 7% decline in industrial activity. We probably had more than 20% decline in industrial activity at various places, at various locations around the planet, originally around Wuhan in China. And sure enough, profound increases in temperature in that region were noted. Same thing when the coronavirus caused a reduction in industrial activity in India. Profound increase in temperature relative to long-term averages. Same thing happened next in a relatively large area in Eurasia, and then finally in the northeastern United States. But it was region by region. It wasn't all in one place at the same time. So your ability to reach conclusions in the absence of evidence is no surprise, because this is sort of pushback I've been receiving for a very long time, never rooted in evidence. As I mentioned once before, Jimmy John, I have a copy of The Mind Illuminated. It was given to me by a friend, and I have read some parts of it, but not the whole thing. No representation. If you were hearing 20% reduction in industrial activity worldwide, then please send me that link, because I've never seen anything close to that. HM sends $5, and apparently that's to ask me the question, do I have any tattoos? Well, not one. Not a single tattoo. I'm not anti-tattoo. I just never felt like it was a good use of my money. So I never got a tattoo. And no, that does not mean that if you send me $1,000 to get a tattoo, I'm going to get a tattoo. Delana wants to know what I learned living off grid in terms of survival tactics, how to grow food and so forth. And the reason I no longer live off grid is that I believe it's more important for me to transmit this message and have access to very good telecommunications infrastructure to do so, despite what happened earlier this evening. I think that's more important than my own personal survival for a few weeks or maybe months beyond reduction in industrial activity. And once I discovered the full impact of aerosol masking, that's when I concluded that it didn't make sense for me to live off grid in a remote region where I no longer had access to the ability to provide this message. So that's why I'm doing this. I don't think that you can significantly extend your life by knowing how to grow food, because the climate will change profoundly in the not too distant future, and that means the weather will change profoundly, and your ability to grow food will be seriously threatened, much less the ability to husband various small animals, ranging from chickens to goats, with ducks and turkeys in there in between, and the occasional goose. So at least for me, it doesn't make sense to provide what might be a few hours or a few days extension of my life, what might be a few weeks or a few months. For me, it doesn't make sense to chase that particular extended lifespan and give up the ability to provide this message in a room that we've turned into a studio and allows conversations such as this one. Where many? Where many? Where many? Hermione. Well, anyway, however you pronounce that, thank you very much for joining the Nature Bad's Last YouTube channel as a climate defender. I think that makes 3 or 4 people who have joined just this evening, so thanks to each of you. Jimmy John, please include a link. I can't keep track based on the title of everything I've read in the last few months, much less years. If I could punch one mainstream climate scientist in the face, would it be Michael Mann? Blink twice if yes. I don't think I would punch anybody in the face, actually. Well, I take that back. I don't think I would punch climate scientists in the face. I have a lot of people who have betrayed me, but none of those climate scientists were personal friends of mine, so therefore they're not in a position to betray me. All right. We're going to wrap this up. Look at that. It's an hour and a half with only about 15 or 20 minutes of that chasing around trying to get the system back online. So thank you, everybody, for joining today. Thanks for the discussion. Thank you for asking questions, some of which I was able to respond to in a reasonable manner. And I apologize for the ones that I don't. And Jimmy John, please, if you can't find the link now, please send me the link via email, guy.r.mcpherson@gmail.com. And that information, my email address, is readily available at guymcpherson.com. So please send me the link to the paper that you're looking at, and I will address that topic with our next live stream, which will be in another week or two. So please stay tuned for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. And no, Delana, our government is not going to tell us that the end is coming. Yes, Hal was nicer to the astronauts than our government is to us. No question about that. You know, a few people enjoy an enormous amount of privilege, and the notion of that privilege going away is not something that they would like to happen. So I don't think any government is going to sound the alarm anytime soon with actual evidence pointing to our imminent demise. And I strongly suspect instead they will continue doing what governments around the world have always done since governments first arose, and that's lie. That's lie by omission or lie by commission, not telling the truth in myriad ways. And the bottom line in every case is retention of privilege for some people and not for the rest. Thank you, everybody, for joining in, and I look forward to doing this next time around, presumably in a week or two. So please stay tuned to guymcpherson.com, where the next live stream will be announced at least a few days in advance.